So earlier we looked at the chemical parts of the innate immune system and the physical parts of the innate immune system, and we looked at phagocytosis, which is the main cellular activity of the innate immune system. So now let's look at the innate immune cells that we're going to cover in this class. So the first one is going to be the macrophage, and macrophages have lots of different functions. They do all over the body. They start their lives as monocytes in the blood. Monocytes are able to defend the blood a little bit, but part of what they do is just circulate so that they can take up residency in a tissue that needs them. And once they get into a tissue after a day or two, they stay there for months. They turn into macrophages and they stay there for months. And they do things like clean up tissue. So they wander around and they find waste particles. They take them in through phagocytosis and they digest them and release them as raw materials nearby cells can use for growth. And this has nothing to do with the immune system. This is just what they do to help tissues function more efficiently. Because as a natural part of any tissue function, occasionally cells go through programmed cell death or apoptosis, and that means there are dead parts of cells that need to be processed, and that's what macrophages do. The other thing they can do, as I said before, they modulate inflammation, and they can, as part of their major job, they present antigens to T cells. So keep track of, again, which cells can do antigen presentation, because we will see this a lot in the adaptive immune system. So macrophages are going to clean up tissues, they're going to fight infections, they're going to modulate inflammation, and as part of their jobs, they can present antigens to T cells. Neutrophils, also called PMNs or polymorphonucleocytes, we could think of as cells that do phagocytosis, but only during infections. So these are going to circulate in the blood, and they will only enter a tissue if a macrophage or other cell in that tissue calls them. So that if they see a signal that says there's an infection in this tissue, then they will enter the tissue and fight. And they can fight by doing phagocytosis and some other things. But again, they only fight. They don't maintain tissues like macrophages do. They don't do antigen presentation. They just fight. And they don't live very long. Dendritic cells are phagocytic cells, just like macrophages and neutrophils, but they have a very specific job. They sample tissues and they bring things in with the intention of presenting them to T cells as antigens. So their primary role is to present antigens to T cells to trigger their activation. And so what they do is they will stay at epithelial layers and use any endocytotic process they can to pull in everything they can and see if maybe it's an antigen a T cell wants. And so once they have collected a lot of potential antigens, then they will move through the lymphatic system to a lymph node where they will present it to T cells. So the dendritic cells really are the eyes of the adaptive immune system. In this, on this slide, we look at some organ-specific macrophages. I'm going to skip over microglia, but they seem to be the main immune cells in the central nervous system. So we don't see macrophages or neutrophils or dendritic cells in the central nervous system. And microglia can be very dangerous if they act incorrectly because they can damage neurons. We have to be very careful, of course, with neurons. And so the immune responses of neurons are very tightly controlled to avoid inflaming central nervous tissue. A much more interesting one are the Kupffer cells. These are macrophages that live in liver sinusoids, and as anything comes in through the through the portal vein to the liver, that could be anything that escaped from the gut, anything that escaped from the spleen, anything that escaped from the stomach. And so all that stuff, plus everything we absorbed from our digestive system, all of that goes to the liver first. And the first cells it encounters in the sinusoids are macrophages, specifically the Kupffer cells. So they make up a huge fraction of the macrophages in the body. And they protect us. And this slide is for curiosity because I don't have any more information about them. They're not in my immunology books. So these are the major phagocytes to know. You might also remember that endothelial cells can do phagocytosis, but we don't really know why. So these are the major phagocytes to know. Macrophages are everywhere. They're involved in a lot of things. They do antigen presentation. Neutrophils come to the site of infection and fight. That's all they do. Dendritic cells look for pathogens, and then they take pieces of them to T cells to present them to the adaptive immune system. Another kind of cell we will probably cover in this class are natural killer cells. These don't do phagocytosis, but they are really important cells for defending us against viruses and cancers. And they are fully innate. But in order to understand how they work, we have to first look at the adaptive immune system, because these interface with the adaptive immune system in very specific ways. And so their functions really depend on actions of the adaptive immune system. So we'll cover them later. So that was the immune system cells. Next, in the next video, we're going to think about pattern recognition and how those phagocytic cells know what should they eat. When do they do phagocytosis? How do they know? That is fundamental to the fact that they are innate cells. So I will see you there.